All right, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 8, Section 4, and the title of this is The Changing Workplace. We're going to be talking about how a growing industrial workforce faced challenges arising from manufacturing in the factory system. And first I've got a little clip that's going to introduce our section.
When the Industrial Revolution began in England, the earliest textile factories employed many young children and paid them almost nothing. But that changed in America because by the mid-1800s, 8 out of every 10 workers in the textile factories were unmarried women between the ages of 15 and 30. Most of them had left behind quiet lives on isolated farms for the adventure of working in a city and earning a steady wage. The conditions were not good in the textile factories, but they did improve over time. The machines tended to be extremely loud and dangerous to operate. The hours were long. The work was quite monotonous, and the air in the factories was filled with tiny bits of fiber that damaged the workers' lungs. The wages were low as well. The mill girls, as they were called, earned less than $3 for putting in a 6-day, 60-hour work week, while men got $1 more a week for doing the same jobs. The lives of the mill girls were almost completely controlled by the factories where they worked. For example, right across the street from this textile factory are the company-owned boarding houses where they slept and ate their meals. Here, the girls were carefully supervised and followed a strict curfew, but they were provided with respectable surroundings that were often more comfortable than those they had known back on the farm. However, as the 19th century rolled on, unskilled factory jobs began to be filled more and more often by recent immigrants to America instead of farm girls. Such jobs provided many immigrant families with a reliable income with which to start their new lives.
Now what we're looking at here is an old charcoal engraving dating back to the early 1800s. It's a drawing of a factory. You see the transportation relied on horsepower. The heat relied on this smokestack, but I would assume the power source came from moving water, or it could have come from steam from the smokestack. Generally, these were dirty places where people were forced to work long hours and had very few rights as workers, rights that we now take for granted today, which were the result of a labor movement dating back to the early part of American history. And so really this is what we'll be talking about today, life at work in early American history. Now, first off, industry. Many manufactured goods were produced in people's homes. There were weaving factories where large-scale production could take place, but these were still few and far between in the United States in the early 1800s. A lot of our production relied on the cottage industry, where families would do work and then sell that work out for profit to entrepreneurs who would purchase these goods made from people's homes and then sell them at a profit. However, the factory system was changing American life. Investors like Francis Cabot Lowell, who opened the first weaving factory in Massachusetts, eventually did so well that he was able to open 8 new factories, hiring 6,000 employees throughout Massachusetts and New England. And so I just wanted to show you an example of the cottage industry. This family might be a farm family living in New England. They might grow food that they need not only to survive, but perhaps to even sell in excess for profit. But as a side income, they might also produce cloth, homespun from cotton. Perhaps they've grown on their own farm, or perhaps a company has contracted out with them to give them the cotton, and this lady will turn it into cloth by hand. And that's the way that much of our clothing was made prior to the factory system. But these early factories excelled at producing items that people could not make themselves. In fact, this is part of an aspect of civilization known as specialization. You have specialized skills, things that you can do that no one else can do. And as you're growing and as you're maturing, you are developing those skills. And you are excelling at them, and you are practicing those things until you are so good at those things that you can make money off of them. Now, the educational system around factories relied on a very old method, the apprenticeship. A young person could hire themselves out to a factory or a craft or a trade and learn from an experienced artisan. It might take years, but they would learn from that person how to do that craft or that trade. That's called an apprenticeship, where you learn that specialized skill from a master, someone who has done it for quite some time. Now, perhaps years later, you've been working under this master. You've developed many of the skills necessary to carry on the trade that you have employed yourself with. Perhaps you might become a journeyman. Maybe you've opened up a new shop under the guise of your master. Maybe you've begun to take on responsibilities at your work, and you can now be trusted. Though you haven't quite mastered whatever it is you're employed with. But then maybe after 10 years, maybe it could take some time, you might eventually be as good as the person that taught you. And that would be the process of learning a skilled trade. This ancient process is still in use today in many trades and professions. For example, maybe you want to learn to work on cars. You can take automotive classes here at the college. You could begin your apprenticeship. You could take a few classes. Excellent. You're going to maybe even get enough certification to go to work as a mechanic. But until you've been practicing for some time, under the watchful eye of someone who's been doing it for a very long time, you're not going to know everything about a car. There's certainly so many cars, it's going to take you a long time, and you're going to need help, ideally experienced help. And so again, this system is not obsolete. You'll still find it in many different industries. Well, factories, the factory system, revolutionized industry. The cost of household items dropped because things could be produced much quicker, but also unskilled workers begin to replace artisans. Now, for example, let's say you want to be a blacksmith. I met a blacksmith this summer. It was really cool. He could turn an axle. He showed me. He had this axle, a car axle. He turned into a knife. It's a beautiful knife. Asked if I could see it. He brought it out. He showed it to me. I was like, wow, that's really nice. How much you charge for that? He said, that one is about $600. And so I was like, whoa, here you go. You can have it back. I thought, okay, $20. Here you go. Here's a knife. Great. No, $600. I was like, wow, what else you got? And he's got, well, I've got this. I found this really neat deer antler in the woods, and I turned it into the handle of a knife. I'm like, oh, cool. Same thing. Okay, what is it? Whoa, way too expensive. All right. Well, this guy had been doing that trade for a very long time. He would certainly qualify as a master of his trade in a skilled profession, because there's a lot of skill required to the profession of being a blacksmith. Now, the factory system changed many of these aspects. For example, we're going to continue watching our story about the young girl and the boy from Ireland, and you saw her learn the trade of working a sewing loom in the course of a day. So whereas maybe you're going to be a mechanic or a blacksmith, and those skills might take years to develop, you could learn a sewing loom in a day. You know, maybe you want to be a lawyer. Maybe it's going to take you a decade of study from now until the time you start practicing. And you'll be a very skilled lawyer in a very specialized field. Or you can go work at Hardee's, and you can learn the whole trade in a few days. Nothing against those who work at Hardee's. Somebody's got to flip our burgers. But again, you can learn how to cook a burger, how to pull fries, and how to bake desserts, how to mix sodas, and how to run a register. You can run all that in a few days or even in a week. When I worked in the restaurant industry, by my second summer, I was managing a restaurant. Okay? I'm not bragging on myself. I'm just telling you it does qualify as unskilled labor. The factory system, in many ways, gave more opportunities for unskilled workers as mass production replaced the old system. For example, you can mass produce tools that would once have been made by hand by very skilled blacksmiths, and now they can be made using the factory system and churn out 1,000 a day. It's just how it is. You know, for example, the skill to make a Rolls-Royce automobile, a handmade car, is incredible. These people have been doing that all their lives. But yet, there is a factory in Iowa that can produce a John Deere tractor the size of this classroom, one every single day.
Wow.
Now, the factory is huge, and it employs a lot of people. I had a buddy who worked there. It's huge. The whole factory is bigger than this campus. But it can make one of those giant combine tractors every single day. But then compare that to the skill that it takes to make one Rolls-Royce. That one person who knows every tool and who crafted every part of that by hand. Which is more efficient? The tractor. Perhaps which is more beautiful? Okay, the Rolls-Royce. Whatever. But this, of course, replaced and made obsolete many skilled professions. Here's an old painting depicting Lowell, Massachusetts. The main thing I wanted to point out here is that you see, though it's kind of unrealistic of a drawing, the factory is located right near the river because that was the source of power. Now, I want to take you inside the mill that this lady was working in. It's called the Lowell Mill in Massachusetts. Most of the workers in this mill were unmarried girls from farms. Some were immigrants, like the lady you've seen in the movie here. They would be under strict control of a factory supervisor. Their lives were regimented. They lived in boarding houses owned by the factory. They had curfews. They had expectations about their behavior, even expectations about how they wore their hair and dressed. Now, owners preferred to hire women because they could pay them lower wages than men. Yet, women still came to these factories in large numbers, and that for every woman that burned out and quit, there were more that could replace them. Because the pay was better than the alternative. Factory pay paid more than teaching. It paid more than sewing. Working in a factory could yield you a better income than bringing home homespun cotton to turn into cloth. It paid more than domestic work. So a young woman could stand to earn an income working in one of these factories, whereas she couldn't earn nearly as much money in any other form of occupation that was available to her at that time. Though the attrition rate, or the burnout rate, was severe. It's the same with many low-skilled occupations today. You know, maybe you're thinking about your first summer job. Maybe you want to work at Ingalls. They have a stack of applications. Your interview process will be short and sweet. Do you want the job? Have you killed anybody? Have you stolen from anybody? Congratulations, you're hired. It's going to be a short interview. I don't mean to burst your bubble. Been there, done that. You'll probably burn out. You'll get sick of it after a few months. You'll start to complain about your boss. Your coworkers are going to be rude. There's going to be drama there. And you'll eventually quit. And again, not to burst your bubble, unless you've really stood out in some way, that's it. No tears shed on either side. Again, nothing personal. That's just the life of unskilled labor. Now, perhaps maybe you can work your way up, become some sort of manager, acquire some degree of responsibility, and move your way up. I have friends who have started out in the restaurant industry and now manage restaurants. Again, I have friends who started out and now have positions of responsibility. But most of you will burn out and quit if you go into an unskilled labor industry. And they expect that. That's why they don't treat you well. Because they expect that you won't last long. Because they can teach someone else your job within a day or two. And so in reality, they don't need you. They need someone, but it doesn't matter who. And so this type of labor is frustrating. And yes, we still have the service industry today. And yes, it is still frustrating to work in that field. Been there, done that. Most of these girls only work there a few years and then they burn out. But it does provide a neat opportunity. And for many of these girls, it's the first time they've ever worked away from home. And some of these girls are the very first girls that have ever worked in their community outside of home and have ever had some degree of freedom. Even though their lives are regimented, for many, this represented a neat opportunity. But next I want to talk about conditions in Lowell. And I hope that you never have to see these types of conditions. 12-hour days. 12-hour days. That means most days sun up to sundown. While slavery has been outlawed, wage slavery replaced it. While slavery has been outlawed, wage slavery has replaced it. Conditions in these factories were deplorable. They were typically very hot with poor ventilation, and that was by design, because the owners of these factories realized that by keeping their factories hot and humid, it was good for the cloth. It doesn't matter if that causes respiratory illness and infections. It doesn't matter if that causes misery of working in an oven, discomfort or illness. As conditions continued to deteriorate, the first strike in the United States occurred, ironically, at the first factory in the United States. A strike is a work stoppage. You know, maybe you're going to get sick of working at Ingalls and you're going to say, I'm not coming in anymore. And the manager's going to go, that's all right. I've got a stack of applications in the back. Have a nice life. Maybe you're going to convince your friends to quit. You'll be like, shipping and receiving is done with you. We're out. We're not unloading your trucks anymore. They're going to be like, whatever. We got a whole stack in the back. We'll have people to replace you tomorrow. But maybe, just maybe, enough of you will quit to cause an uproar. Doubtful, because people need those jobs. Nobody works in Ingalls because they love Ingalls. People work at Ingalls because they need the work. You know, my mother-in-law works at Ingalls. I've worked in grocery, and I'm sure many of you will. Not a thing wrong with it. I'm just telling you, the conditions are not always the happiest. And it's the same at this factory. You see, if one worker quits, if that young lady had quit after getting her hair caught and how she was treated, the guy wouldn't have cared. Stack of applications. 800 girls walked off of this factory. That's when it began to matter. That's when it made the history books. The first strike was over a cut in their pay. It's bad enough they have to work 12-hour days in a hot, humid factory under rigid control. But now their pay is cut for no other reason than that the owner wanted to increase his profits. The next strike was over an increase in their rent. Yeah, because they lived in boarding houses that were owned by the factory. So the first strike in 1834 was over a cut in their pay. And the jerk had the audacity to increase their rent. Why? Because they could make more money that way if they paid their workers less and they charged them more for rent. It was all about profit. And again, these people were unskilled workers. They might as well have been machines to the owner. Didn't even think of them as people. In both cases, in both strikes in early American history, the company won. All they had to do was fire the leaders of the strike, invite the others to come back, and tell them plainly, we don't care if you come back. We'll find somebody else. You want to be an unskilled worker? These are the types of conditions you'll have to face. And this led to the first Labor Reform Association. Because you see, if this had been in the end of the story, you're having your conversation with your friends at work and you're going, man, this sucks. And your friend goes, yeah. And then you go, well, I need the work. Okay. But then after a while, you get sick of being treated badly and you say, I'm out. And the manager goes, whatever. In this case, I just want you to understand, 800 people walked off the job twice. And in both cases, the owner just fired the people in charge and brought them back. Here's a picture of these women at the Lowell boarding house. Same place that you're watching the movie of. This is the company homes that they were required to live in. Homes where they paid rent to the factory with pay they received from the factory. Tell me how this is much different than slavery. I mean, I guess there is the point. They had the right to leave. They could quit. Okay. They wouldn't be beaten or killed. They weren't considered property, though perhaps they were treated as property. Now, the story of the first strike ended badly. 800 people organized on 2 occasions at that factory, and both times they failed. Because they were unskilled workers. Because stack of applications in the back, and the fact that it takes a day to train new people. Where the movement became effective was when we began to see skilled workers, artisans, form unions, allying themselves with unskilled workers. For example, I have a friend who's an electrician. He's a part of a national union. It means he can go to work anywhere in the country as an electrician. He lives in Ohio. He sometimes comes here, works part-time, enjoys the area, and then goes back home. Since he's part of this union, he can do that. But he's a skilled worker. You and I start messing with wires, we'll get shocked and kill ourselves. He can rewire a house or a car, you name it. If it's got electricity, he can fix it. That's a skilled profession. He's been doing it for a very long time. He's not easily replaceable. If he quits, someone's going to try to convince him to stay. If that union organizes and goes on strike, we're in big trouble as a country. We need those people. Stack of applications doesn't apply to the skilled workers. By the 1830s and 1840s, there were very few people that had organized into unions. In fact, only really 1 to 2% of workers in the United States had organized. However, these people that had organized had already employed the strike dozens of times. Often, especially in the case of unskilled workers, employers would hire immigrants to replace skilled workers. This happens so often, these immigrants were called scabs. People coming off the boat from Ireland, Scotland, didn't matter where, Russia, Poland, etc. And they were desperate for work. And they come into a town like Boston, needing work, fresh off the boat, got to find a place. Well, guess who's hiring? The mills. Why? Because there's a strike going on. Well, they don't have the luxury of being political. They just have to have a job. As immigration increased in the United States throughout the mid-1800s, we see immigrants cluster into various places. For example, Germans clustered in the upper Mississippi Valley. Throughout the Ohio River Valley, you can find a lot of German names in that part of the country. We also see another wave of Irish immigrants, like the story that we're watching, settling in many large eastern cities, such as New York or Boston. In fact, the Boston police force today is still primarily Irish. The Irish immigrants tended to be Catholic, tended to be poor. Many were coming over here because of a famine that had killed over 1 million people due to starvation in Ireland, and coming here desperate, needing a new place and opportunity. And were willing to work for low pay, because that's often the story of immigrants coming here in the United States, is that they have been willing to take jobs for lower pay out of desperation. And yet I've heard so much conversation in this election about people looking down on immigrants. So much nasty rhetoric about immigration. And yet we've forgotten this fact, that many of our families came here in the early and mid-1800s under the same conditions. This engraving shows immigrants in 1848 arriving from Europe. You see Irish, you see Scottish, you see Anglos, you see etc. Now, the old slogan of the United Farm Workers was, "United we stand, divided we fall." You see, you can fire an individual. Heck, you can fire a whole factory and replace them. But the movement continued to grow. People unionized throughout the 1830s. Trade unions formed, uniting to standardize wages. If everyone in an entire industry joined together, they could collectively bargain for better rights. They could collectively bargain for better working conditions. And these rights that we have as workers were fought for and bled for and died for, just like these rights that we have as Americans. By 1834, the very first National Trades Union had formed. But yet, the owners of these factories were no fools. They also organized. And it became a long-standing war between workers and owners. But the workers had much of the power. Sometime you need to read People's History of the United States. You'll hear the side of the workers, the side of the people, and their story told and emphasized. We'll use excerpts from that book throughout this class. Because you see, these rights that we have, that we take for granted, did you know the weekend was the result of years of fighting and strikes and people getting fired and beaten so that we could have a weekend? And now we don't even think about it. We're just like, oh yeah, weekend. Cool. That's when I do fun things. No, that was fought for. That was bled for. And people died for those weekends. You're like, what am I doing this weekend? Now, typically, the courts, the government, would rule in favor of the owners of these companies because they had the money. They could buy the influence. However, the labor movement started to see real success. By 1842, Massachusetts Supreme Court upheld workers' rights to strike. Yet, by the time of the Civil War, there were only 5,000 members of unions around the United States. And they could count on and rally about 20,000 workers in our country to go on strike if necessary. Enough to have small local success, but not enough yet to make a national difference. But this is the beginning of a movement that would result in things like a weekend, or minimum wage, or an 8-hour work week, or the right to feel safe at work. Basic things that you take for granted, people have fought for. All right. What do you think? What was the main reason most immigrants avoided the South in the mid-1800s?
Yeah, they couldn't find love.
So that was based in Massachusetts, by the way. So on a different note, in the South, good, slavery. I mean, okay, conditions sucked in these factories, but they weren't slaves. And not too many people, I mean, yeah, there's that.
Now you have heard of women's rights and how we've tried to reach new heights. If we're all created equal, that's us too. Yeah, but you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, sure, some men bow down and call dismissal. Yeah. Let us hang the wash out and wash the dishes. But when the time rolled around to elect a president, what did they say, sister?
What did they say?
They said, see you later, alligator. And don't forget my mashed potatoes, 'cause I'm going downtown to cast my vote for president. But we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. And the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Oh, yeah. And now we pull down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Tell them about those pilgrim women who braved the boat. They could cook the turkey, but they could not vote. Even Betsy Ross, who showed the flag, was left behind. night, first election day.
What a shame, sisters.
Then Susan B., Anthony,
Yeah.
and Julia Howe,
Lucretia.
Ma.
And others.
They showed us how they carried signs and marched in lines until at long last the law was passed. Oh, we were suffering until suffrage. Not a woman who could vote no matter what age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule.
Oh, yeah.
And now we cool down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Yeah. Yes, the 9